The elevator doors were closing when Malcolm slipped through. Coffee in one hand, tie not quite straight, 8 minutes late on the first day of the job that was supposed to fix everything. She was already inside, standing like she'd been there for hours, like the whole morning hadn't just tried to swallow her whole the way it had him. She glanced over once, the way people do in elevators, then looked away. He should have looked away too. Instead, he said, "Please tell me this building has a time machine somewhere on the 7th floor." She turned back slowly, one eyebrow up. "Rough morning? I have cereal in my jacket pocket and I'm not entirely sure how it got there." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Something better. The look of a woman deciding whether a man was worth her time and leaning just slightly toward yes. They talked for 6 floors. Nothing important. Nothing that should have meant anything. But by the time the doors opened, Malcolm felt something he hadn't felt in years. Like a man who still had room in his life for something that wasn't survival. He walked into the conference room, still half smiling. Then the door at the front of the room opened, and she walked in, jacket buttoned, expression unreadable, and set her portfolio down at the head of the table. His new boss. Her. What they didn't see was the math he ran constantly underneath it. How many days until the next bill? Whether the custody arrangement could survive another disruption? How much longer the transmission on his car had before it became someone else's problem? He'd been doing the math for 4 years. Since Zoe's mother left. Since the decent-paying contract work dried up and he spent 18 months patching together income from 3 different jobs, none of which came with benefits or a future. Since a family court judge looked at his finances and used the word unstable in a sentence that also contained his daughter's name. That word had followed him into every job application since. He wasn't about to let it follow him into Callaway and Associates. The position was a mid-level analyst role. Not glamorous, not the kind of thing that made people lean forward at dinner parties, but it came with a salary that could actually cover rent and childcare without making him choose between them. It came with health insurance. It came with the possibility that, 12 months from now, a judge might look at Malcolm Carter and use a different word. He needed this job the way people need oxygen. Quietly, completely, without the luxury of imagining what it would feel like to go without it. Which was why the morning had to be perfect. It was not perfect. It started at 5:47 when Zoe knocked her bowl off the table. Not dramatically, not on purpose, just the ordinary gravitational disaster of an 8-year-old who was more interested in the drawing she was finishing than in the cereal she was supposed to be eating. Milk spread across the kitchen floor with the quiet efficiency of a natural disaster. Malcolm cleaned it up, remade breakfast, checked his tie in the bathroom mirror while Zoe sat on the closed toilet lid and told him in great detail about a dream she'd had involving a talking dog and a disagreement over sandwiches. "You're not listening," she said. "I'm listening and mopping," he said. "I'm multitasking." "You look nervous." "I'm not nervous." She considered him with the particular skepticism that 8-year-olds reserve for adults who are clearly lying. Then she slid off the toilet lid, reached into the craft box she'd dragged into the bathroom the night before, and folded something with practiced precision. A small star, made from a strip of yellow paper, the kind she'd been making by the dozen lately. She tucked it into the breast pocket of his suit jacket before he could object. "Zoe, so you don't forget someone's waiting for you," she said, already heading back to the kitchen. Malcolm looked at his reflection. The star was sticking out at an angle that was not, by any reasonable standard, professional. He adjusted his pocket square to cover it. He didn't take it out. Traffic on the 9th Street corridor added 11 minutes he didn't have. He dropped Zoe at school 4 minutes after the bell, accepted the look from the front desk attendant without comment, and drove to the Callaway building with his jaw set and his coffee going cold in the cup holder. By the time he reached the lobby, he was 8 minutes late, running on 4 hours of sleep and carrying a knot of tension between his shoulder blades that no amount of deep breathing was going to touch. He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened, and inside, standing very still and very unbothered, was a woman who looked like the morning had not dared to inconvenience her. She was already looking at her phone when he stepped in, which was the only reason he had a second to collect himself before she glanced up.
Late 30s, maybe.
Natural hair pulled back with the kind of effortlessness that takes longer than it looks. A charcoal blazer that fit like it had been made specifically for her shoulders. She had the posture of someone who had learned early that rooms don't give you space. You have to decide you're taking it. Malcolm pressed the button for 7, stepped back, stared at the floor numbers the way people do when they're pretending an elevator isn't small. Then he said it. He still wasn't sure why. Please tell me this building has a time machine somewhere on the 7th floor. She looked up from her phone, took him in without rushing. Rough morning? I have cereal in my jacket pocket and I'm not entirely sure how it got there. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile, something more guarded than that, but real. The look of a woman deciding whether a man was worth the energy, and not immediately deciding against it. That's either a very bad morning, she said, or a very unusual breakfast strategy. The first one. Definitely the first one. First day somewhere? He looked down at himself, the tie slightly off-center, the jacket a little too pressed in the way that only happens when someone is trying too hard. Is it that obvious? The cereal helped narrow it down. He laughed, actually laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere real rather than politeness. And something loosened in his chest that he hadn't realized was knotted up. Not the anxiety about the job or the guilt about dropping Zoe off late, but something older and quieter. The part of him that had been so focused on keeping things from falling apart that it had forgotten what it felt like to just be a man in a room, talking to a woman who was looking at him like he was worth looking at. Malcolm, he said. She held his gaze a half-second longer than necessary. Good luck today, Malcolm. The doors opened on 7.
She stepped out first.
He followed, assuming different directions, different departments, different orbits, the way strangers always do when an elevator moment ends and the rest of the day reasserts itself. He found the conference room, poured himself water he didn't need, chose a seat in the middle of the table, not the back, not the front, somewhere that said, I belong here without saying I'm trying to prove it. 2 other analysts filed in. Someone from HR set up a laptop. Malcolm straightened his notepad and reminded himself, for the last time, why this day had to go well. Then the door opened at the front of the room. She walked in. Same blazer, same posture, a leather portfolio under her arm, and an expression that had closed over completely. Professional, neutral, revealing nothing. She set the portfolio at the head of the table, looked out at the room with the calm of someone who had done this 100 times, and said, Good morning. I'm Avery Cole, Director of Strategic Analysis. This is your department. Malcolm sat very still. His water glass was halfway to his mouth. He set it down. She didn't look at him. That was the first thing he noticed. Avery Cole moved through the introductory meeting with the precision of someone who had run this exact session before. Names, expectations, departmental structure, a brief overview of the 2 projects currently in progress. She made eye contact with everyone at the table in turn, the way good managers do, distributing attention evenly so no one feels overlooked. When she reached Malcolm, she held his gaze for exactly as long as she held everyone else's. Not a flicker, not a pause. Nothing that said, I know you, or this is strange, or even, yes, I remember the cereal comment. Just, next. He spent the rest of the meeting doing the thing he was best at, keeping his face completely still while his mind ran in 6 directions at once. He took notes he didn't need. He nodded at the right moments. He asked one question near the end, something about reporting structure, and his voice came out steady, which felt like a minor miracle. When the meeting ended and people began filtering out, Malcolm stayed in his seat an extra beat, letting the room thin. He wasn't avoiding her. He was just recalibrating, finding the version of himself that could walk out of this room and into the next 4 weeks without doing anything that would cost him the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. The calculus was simple, if brutal. He had flirted with his boss on the first morning of the first real job he'd had in 4 years. The job that was supposed to stabilize his finances, strengthen his custody case, and give Zoe the kind of home that didn't require her father to lie awake doing math at 2 in the morning. One moment of being a person instead of a plan. That's all it had been. He could bury it. People buried things all the time. Within the first 2 weeks, Malcolm had rebuilt the tracking model for the Harmon account from scratch, identified a data gap in the quarterly projections that 2 senior analysts had missed, and done it all without drawing attention to the fact that he'd done it. He let the work speak at a volume that couldn't be ignored, but didn't require him to raise his voice. Avery noticed. He could tell by the way she didn't say anything, the particular quality of silence from a manager who is watching and recalibrating, deciding where someone fits in a picture they're still assembling. She gave him a harder assignment at the end of week 2. He finished it in 3 days. He told himself that was the whole point. Prove the work, justify the seat, give everyone, absolutely nothing else to look at. It almost worked. The problem was proximity. The department wasn't large. Avery ran tight meetings, expected concise updates, and had a habit of asking follow-up questions that required you to have actually thought about the problem rather than just reported on it. Which meant that twice a week, minimum, Malcolm sat across a conference table from her and was reminded that the woman in the elevator and the director at the head of the room were the same person. She was harder here than she'd been in those 6 floors, sharper. She had the particular manner of someone who had learned to take up space through competence rather than volume. She rarely repeated herself, rarely softened a critique, and had a way of holding a room's attention without appearing to want it. Malcolm had worked for people who led through fear and people who led through ego. Avery led through clarity. She was simply always the most prepared person in the room, and she made sure everyone knew it without ever having to say so. He understood, gradually, what that cost her. The comments were small and easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. A senior partner who addressed questions to the man beside her before deferring to her. A client who called her Hun in an email chain that copied the entire department. The way certain colleagues, Derek Hayes in particular, a lateral analyst with a tight smile and an obvious awareness of his own positioning, had a habit of slightly rephrasing her conclusions in meetings, as if the ideas needed a different voice to land properly. Avery absorbed all of it without breaking stride, never flinched, never addressed it directly, just kept moving, kept working, kept being impossible to dismiss no matter how many small dismissals accumulated around her. Malcolm noticed because he knew the posture. The particular set of a person's jaw when they have decided that reacting is a luxury they cannot afford. He wore it himself most days. He started watching her differently after that. Not the way he had in the elevator. That had been instinct, reflex. The part of him that existed before 4 years of single parenthood had restructured his priorities. This was something quieter. Recognition. The uneasy sense that he understood something about her that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with the fact that they were, in some fundamental way, running the same race on different tracks, which was exactly the kind of thought he needed to stop having. The barriers were not subtle. She was his direct supervisor. The company handbook had a full page on internal relationships. He'd read it, not because he was planning anything, but because knowing where the lines were made it easier to stay inside them. The department was small enough that a shift in dynamic would be noticed within days. Derek Hayes already watched Malcolm with the focused attention of someone keeping score. And underneath all of it, the thing that mattered most, Zoe. The custody review was 8 months out. Any disruption to his employment, any question about his judgment, his professionalism, his stability, could hand his ex-wife's attorney exactly the narrative they were looking for. He had exactly one path through this, and it was straight. He took it. Every morning he took it, and every morning it got a little harder to pretend he wasn't taking it. It was a Thursday evening, 6:17, and the floor was mostly empty. Avery was still at her desk. She usually was at this hour when the open plan office had cleared out enough for her to think without managing the ambient noise of other people's opinions. She had her reading glasses on and a spreadsheet open that was not going to fix itself, and she had every intention of being done by 7. She heard them before she saw them. A small voice in the hallway asking something about the water cooler. Then Malcolm's voice, lower, patient in the particular way of a parent who is tired but refuses to let it show. Avery looked up just as they came through the glass door, Malcolm with his bag over one shoulder and his jacket already off, and behind him, half hidden and then not, a small girl with her father's eyes and a backpack covered in hand-drawn stars. Malcolm saw Avery immediately. Something moved across his face. Not quite alarm, not quite embarrassment, something in between that he controlled within a second. "I'm sorry," he said, stopping near the door. "Mrs. Patterson had a family emergency. I only need 20 minutes to finish the Harmon summary. I can work from the corner. She won't be any trouble." "It's fine," Avery said. She meant it as a dismissal, a professional courtesy. "It's fine. I don't need an explanation. Do what you need to do." She turned back to her screen, but the girl was looking at her. Not the way children usually look at strangers, cautiously, briefly, before retreating to the safety of a parent. This one was looking at her the way a person looks at something they've been trying to figure out for a while and have just been handed a new piece of evidence. Direct, unhurried, assessing. "Are you the one from his job?" she asked. Malcolm said, "Zoe." "I'm his boss, yes," Avery said. Zoe considered this. She walked, without asking, without apparent concern, 3 steps closer to Avery's desk and tilted her head. "Are you mean to him?" "Zoe." Malcolm's voice carried a warning that his daughter appeared to be completely unbothered by. "I'm just asking," Zoe said with the dignity of someone who found the interruption unnecessary. Avery took her glasses off. "No," she said, "I don't think I am. He comes home tired. Most people come home tired. He comes home a different kind of tired than before." Zoe said it plainly, like she was reporting a fact she'd logged and cross-referenced. "Before it was regular tired, now it's like..." She paused, searching. "Like when you're carrying something heavy and you're not sure if you should put it down." The office was very quiet. Avery looked at this child, 8 years old, backpack covered in stars, delivering observations that a trained therapist would have charged by the hour, and felt something shift behind her sternum. Small and sudden, like a door she hadn't noticed opening. "What's your name?" Avery asked. "Zoe. What's yours?" "Avery." Zoe nodded slowly, as though filing this away. Then, "He doesn't say your name, but he seems different since he started here." Malcolm, from across the room where he'd pulled out his laptop and was very deliberately not looking up, said quietly, "Zoe, please let Ms. Cole work." "I'm just talking." "I know what you're doing." Zoe turned back to Avery without remorse. She unzipped the front pocket of her backpack, produced a folded strip of yellow paper, and set it on the edge of Avery's desk with the solemnity of a diplomat delivering a treaty. "I make these for people I like," she said. "You can have it." Then she walked back to the chair beside her father's temporary desk, climbed up, pulled out a book, and began to read as if none of it had happened. Avery looked down at the paper star on the corner of her desk. She didn't move it. For the next 20 minutes, she stared at the spreadsheet and absorbed almost nothing, because she was thinking about the word Zoe had used. Different. And the precise, unsettling accuracy of a child who loved her father well enough to notice changes in the specific weight of his exhaustion. She had spent 3 weeks looking at Malcolm Carter through the only lens she'd allowed herself: supervisor, liability, professional boundary. She had been very good at it. She had made it look effortless, the way she made most things look effortless, because the effort itself was not something she put on display. But Zoe had looked at her father and seen something worth noting, something worth walking across a room for. And sitting alone in the emptied office, the paper star at the edge of her desk catching the last of the evening light, Avery felt the first real crack in an armor she had spent years learning to believe was her personality. Derek Hayes was not a man who lost things gracefully. He had applied for the strategic analysis position 4 months before Malcolm was hired, had made it to the final round, had already begun mentally rearranging his business cards, and then lost it to someone the partners brought in from outside the shortlist, someone they'd found through a recruiter, someone who, as far as Derek was concerned, had walked into a seat that had his name on it. He hadn't said any of this out loud. Derek Hayes was too careful for that. What he did instead was watch. Quietly, consistently, with the particular patience of a man who understood that the most effective damage is the kind that looks like it came from somewhere else. He noticed the elevator. He'd been crossing the lobby that first morning when Malcolm stepped out, still carrying the warmth of a conversation Derek hadn't heard but could read in the geometry of it. The way Malcolm's posture had shifted, the fraction of a second too long before Avery resumed her professional expression. Derek filed it away the way he filed everything, without comment, without hurry. Over the following weeks he collected details. A meeting that ran 7 minutes longer than necessary when Malcolm was the last one presenting. An assignment redirected to Malcolm that Derek had expected to receive. A Tuesday afternoon when Avery stopped at Malcolm's desk for what was technically a work conversation, and then did not stop at anyone else's. None of it was proof of anything. That was the point. Derek wasn't interested in proof. He was interested in the appearance of proof, submitted anonymously to Human Resources under the subject line, "Concern regarding potential bias in project allocation." The report was 4 paragraphs, clinical in tone, careful not to allege anything it couldn't imply. It referenced dates, meeting durations, assignment patterns. It did not mention the elevator. It didn't need to. Malcolm found out on a Wednesday afternoon from an HR coordinator who called him into a small conference room and used the word inquiry 4 times in 10 minutes. She was careful to frame it as preliminary, nothing determined, nothing formal, just an internal flag that needed to be looked into. He should continue his work as normal while the matter was reviewed at the departmental level. Malcolm said the right things, thanked her, walked back to his desk. That evening his phone rang. Diane, Zoe's mother living in Phoenix with a new partner and an attorney she'd retained when the custody arrangement was first drafted. She had heard through the particular speed at which information travels through shared social networks that something was happening at Malcolm's new job. She was not calling to check on him. "I just want to make sure Zoe is in a stable environment," she said in the voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "If there's any disruption to your employment—" "There isn't," Malcolm said. "I'm just saying, Judge Hartwell takes consistency seriously." He knew exactly what she was saying. He'd known since the custody agreement was signed that any crack in his stability would be treated as a structural failure. That was the game. Not to win outright, but to maintain indefinitely a standard of living and conduct that left no room for a different interpretation. One anonymous report, one inquiry, one sentence from Diane about Judge Hartwell. The walls of the life he'd been carefully building around himself and Zoe had just gotten considerably thinner. What made it worse, what made it specifically, precisely worse, was Zoe herself. She had started asking about Avery. Not constantly, not in a way that demanded anything, just the occasional question dropped into dinner conversation with the casualness of a child who doesn't yet understand that some subjects are complicated. Does she like her job? Is she nice to the other people too? Can I show her my new drawing next time? Malcolm always answered carefully, always redirected gently, always made sure his voice didn't carry the weight his chest was holding. But he knew what it meant when Zoe started asking about someone. She had her father's instincts. She didn't attach easily, and when she did, she meant it. That was the part that scared him most. Not what he stood to lose, what she did. The inquiry became official on a Friday morning. Avery had seen it coming by Thursday. She had gone to Paulson, the HR director, that Thursday afternoon before the formal process was triggered, and made the request herself. It was cleaner that way, proactive rather than reactive. She identified the supervisory conflict directly, proposed the structural solution, and made sure the language on record reflected a procedural adjustment rather than an admission of anything improper. Paulson had thanked her for her professionalism. She had driven home and sat in her parked car for 19 minutes. Malcolm learned about it Friday morning from Paulson directly, who explained in the measured tone of someone reading from a policy manual that during the review period, Malcolm would be temporarily reassigned to the research support division on the 4th floor. Not a demotion, Paulson was careful to say, a structural adjustment to ensure the integrity of the process. Malcolm nodded, asked one question about timeline, thanked him. He was back at his desk in 4 minutes packing the things that were his. Avery's office door was closed. He told himself she was in a meeting. Then he told himself it didn't matter. Then he picked up the framed photo of Zoe he'd set on his desk that first week, the one where she was mid-laugh at something off-camera, completely unguarded, and put it in his bag, and that was the moment it became real. He had built something here, small and new and careful, but real, and now he was carrying it out in a canvas tote bag while people pretended not to watch. In the elevator going down, the same elevator, the same 7 floors, he stood very still and looked at the numbers and did not think about the last time he'd ridden it with any kind of hope. He heard from a colleague 3 days later that Avery had requested the reassignment herself, had gone to Paulson the day before it was made official, before the formal process had even been triggered. The colleague mentioned it the way people mention things they know will land hard, with a slight hesitation beforehand and a careful neutrality of tone. Malcolm thanked him for letting him know, hung up, sat at his kitchen table for a long time without moving. She had requested it, before she had to, on her own terms. He turned it over the way you turn over something you're hoping to find a different explanation for, looking at it from every angle until you've exhausted the charitable readings and are left with the one that was true from the beginning. She had looked at the situation, the report, the inquiry, the risk to her position, and made the calculation that he was the thing she could afford to put down. He understood it. That was the worst part. He understood it completely, the way you understand a decision that is logical and reasonable and still takes something from you that you hadn't budgeted for. That night, after Zoe was asleep, Malcolm sat on the edge of his bed and emptied his jacket pockets onto the nightstand. Keys, his work badge that now opened a different floor, a gas station receipt. And then, from the breast pocket, the paper star. Still there, still yellow, slightly creased from weeks of being carried. He unfolded it carefully, because it wasn't the kind of thing you unfolded fast. Inside, in the large, deliberate handwriting of a child who had recently decided cursive was worth learning, were 7 words. "You are the bravest person I know." Malcolm read it once, then again. Then he set it flat on the nightstand and looked at it for a long time in the dark. The 4th floor was quieter than the 7th. That was the first thing Malcolm noticed about his reassignment. Not the different desk, not the different faces, not the work that was technically fine and felt like standing still, just the quiet. The absence of the particular friction that had made the last several weeks feel, despite everything, like he was somewhere that mattered. He did his work. He did it well. He came home to Zoe every evening and helped with homework and made dinner and sat across the table from his daughter and tried to locate, somewhere inside the routine of it, the feeling that this was enough. Some nights it was. Most nights it almost was. The question that wouldn't leave him alone wasn't about Avery. It was older than that, and harder, and it lived in the space between who he was and who he was allowed to want to be. He had built his entire life around one central premise: Zoe first. Every decision, every sacrifice, every morning he got up and ran the math again, all of it was for her. And he believed that. He didn't resent it. Being her father was the one thing in his life he had never once questioned. But somewhere in the last several weeks, a different question had surfaced. Small at first, easy to ignore, then impossible to put back down. Did doing right by Zoe require him to have nothing left for himself? Avery, meanwhile, was doing what she always did when something was wrong. She worked harder and felt less. It had served her well for 15 years. She had built her career on the principle that competence was the cleanest answer to every complicated question. That if you were simply undeniable, the things that tried to deny you eventually ran out of room. It had worked. She had the title, the salary, the corner-adjacent office. She had built something real from nothing handed to her. What she had not built, what she had not noticed herself failing to build, was the ability to want something and simply let herself want it. She sat in the empty office on a Friday evening, reading glasses on, the paper star Zoe had left on her desk still sitting in the corner where it had been for 2 weeks. She had moved files around it, had worked within its orbit without ever picking it up or throwing it away. She called Renee that night, her oldest friend, the only one who had known her before the title and the blazers and the learned habit of making difficulty look like composure. Renee answered on the second ring. "I don't know what I'm doing," Avery said, which was not something she said often or ever. Renee was quiet for a moment, then, "Do you want to tell me what happened, or do you want me to already know?" "I moved him to a different floor to protect both of us, and now I feel like I did something wrong." "Did you?" Avery looked at the paper star. "I did it the right way, by the book, cleanly." "That's not what I asked." A long silence. "I don't want to lose him," Avery said. "Not I made a strategic error, not I need to correct a professional misstep. Something simpler and more frightening than either of those. We haven't even, it's just, I don't want to lose him." "Then don't," Renee said, like it was simple. Avery stared at the wall of her apartment for a while after they hung up. Then she went to her laptop and opened Malcolm's personnel file. Not the inquiry documents, not the HR notes. The original application. She had read it once, quickly, during the hiring process. She read it again now. Near the end, in the section asking candidates to describe their long-term professional goals, Malcolm had written 2 sentences. "I want to build something stable enough that my daughter grows up knowing that effort means something. I want her to see that." Avery read it twice. Then she closed the file, picked up her phone, and started making calls. The truth about Derek Hayes took Avery 4 days to assemble and 11 minutes to present. She did it methodically, pulling access logs from the internal camera system, cross-referencing timestamps with the dates cited in the anonymous report, requesting the original email routing data from IT under the pretense of a departmental audit. What emerged was not dramatic. It was precise. Derek had photographed a conversation between Avery and Malcolm, a Tuesday afternoon discussion about the Harmon account, 3 minutes long, entirely on record, and submitted it as evidence of something it wasn't. He had cropped the context. He had framed the ordinary as the suspicious, and then made sure someone with authority would see it that way. She laid it out in front of the partners without editorializing. Dates, images, routing data, the original meeting notes confirming what the conversation had actually been about. She requested that the inquiry into Malcolm Carter be closed and his position on the 7th floor reinstated. She also submitted a formal proposal to restructure the direct reporting line between her role and his, a lateral adjustment that removed the supervisory conflict cleanly and permanently. Paulson said it was thorough. One of the senior partners said she should have come forward sooner. Avery said evenly that she was there now. Then she left. Malcolm got the call on a Thursday morning while he was eating breakfast across from Zoe, who was eating toast and telling him, in significant detail, about a disagreement at recess involving a disputed rule in Foursquare. He held up one finger, 1 second, and stepped into the hallway. Paulson told him the inquiry had been closed. The reassignment was rescinded. His position on the 7th floor was his, effective Monday. Malcolm thanked him, hung up, stood in the hallway for a moment with his hand still on the phone. Then he went back to the table, sat down, and looked at his daughter. "Good news?" Zoe asked without looking up from her toast. "Yeah," he said, "good news." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to the Foursquare story. He let her finish it, the disputed rule, the resolution, the part where she had apparently mediated the entire disagreement to everyone's satisfaction. He listened the way he always listened to her, completely, because she had learned to watch for whether he was actually paying attention or just nodding in the right places, and she deserved the real thing. When she was done, he said, "Can I tell you something?" She looked up. "I've been scared," he said. these past few weeks, about work, about a lot of things. And I think I let the scared part make some decisions that the rest of me didn't agree with. Zoe thought about this with the seriousness she brought to everything. Like what? Like thinking that wanting good things for myself was the same as taking them away from you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she got up, went to the craft drawer, came back with a strip of yellow paper and sat back down. She began folding, her small hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made 1,000 of these. You know what's dumb? She said, not looking up. What? Thinking you have to be sad so I can be okay. She creased the last fold and set the finished star on the table between them. I'm not a baby. I know when you're happy, I like it better. Malcolm looked at the star, then at his daughter. When did you get this smart? I've always been this smart, she said. You just worry too much to notice. He went back on Monday. His desk was where he'd left it. The framed photo of Zoe went back in its corner. The work was where it always was, waiting, impersonal, indifferent to everything that had happened around it. From his bag, he took out the original paper star, the one Zoe had tucked into his pocket on the first morning, the one he'd carried for weeks, the one he'd finally unfolded in the dark. He set it flat on his desk beside the photo, creased and open, 7 words facing up. Avery stopped by at 10:15. She didn't sit. She stood at the edge of his desk the way she stood at the head of a room, present, direct, not performing ease she didn't feel. The Harmon deadline moved up, she said. I need the revised model by Wednesday. You'll have it Tuesday, he said. She nodded, started to turn. Avery. She stopped. He didn't say thank you. She wouldn't have wanted that. It would have made her the rescuer and him the rescued, and neither of them were built for that kind of story. Instead, he held her gaze for a moment, long enough to mean something, and said, Tuesday, and maybe after coffee, if you want. She looked at him, then at the paper star on his desk. Something moved behind her eyes, recognition, or the particular expression of a person who has just decided to stop pretending a door is closed when they've been standing next to it for weeks. Tuesday, she said, then coffee, and she walked away. Not because the conversation was over, because it was, for the first time, actually beginning. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning, Avery sat at Malcolm's kitchen table with a mug she had started to think of as hers and a half-finished drawing Zoe had pushed in front of her without explanation. The drawing appeared to be of 3 people, 1 tall, 1 medium, 1 small, standing in front of something that might have been a house or possibly a very large sandwich. Zoe had not clarified. Malcolm was at the stove, and the apartment smelled like coffee and eggs, and Zoe was on the floor nearby, building something elaborate out of paper and tape, and a focus so total that she hadn't looked up in 12 minutes. It was not dramatic. It was not the version of happiness that announces itself. It was a Saturday morning. It was a mug on a table. It was a child who had decided without being asked that someone was worth a drawing. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. There's a version of Malcolm's story where he keeps his eyes down in that elevator and says nothing, where he plays it safe and never finds out what happens when you stop shrinking yourself to fit the space fear leaves you. But that's not the story he chose. And it doesn't have to be yours either, because here's what this story is really about. A man who had spent 4 years believing that being a good father meant having nothing left for himself, and a woman who had spent 15 years believing that strength meant never needing anyone, and a little girl who looked at both of them and saw, with the clear eyes that only children have, that they were wrong. You don't have to earn the right to want something. You don't have to be finished struggling before you're allowed to reach for more. Malcolm didn't get his life together and then find happiness. He found the courage to want it, and that's what started everything. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and follow along. There are more stories here about real people navigating real choices, the kind that don't come with easy answers, but always come with something worth finding. And the next time life puts you in an elevator with a reason to smile, don't look at the floor.